There's a specific moment worth examining directly, one that arrives differently for everyone, but that carries the same fundamental weight, regardless of the specific circumstances that produce it. The moment when accumulated confusion, accumulated self-doubt, and accumulated explanation-seeking finally completely resolves into clear, unshakable understanding of exactly who this person actually is. Today, we're tracing what this specific moment actually involves, why it typically arrives so much later than the evidence alone would seem to justify, and what genuinely happens once it finally, completely occurs. Let's start with understanding why this moment takes so long to arrive, despite the fact that the underlying evidence often accumulates considerably earlier. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how narcissistic relationships specifically train sustained self-doubt, gradual erosion of trust in your own perception, and generous, contextual interpretation of behavior that would otherwise seem obviously concerning. This means clarity doesn't typically arrive because new evidence suddenly appears. It arrives because something finally shifts in how you're processing evidence that's often been present in some form for considerably longer than you'd initially recognize. Here's what actually happens in the moment clarity finally, completely arrives. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about pattern recognition requiring accumulated observation over time rather than any single dramatic revelation. The specific moment of finally seeing clearly rarely arrives through one decisive event, despite how it might feel in retrospect. It typically arrives when accumulated evidence finally reaches a threshold where the explanations you've been offering yourself, "He's just stressed, he didn't mean it that way, I'm probably overreacting," simply stop being sustainable, not because any single new piece of evidence proved decisive, but because the accumulated weight of everything together finally exceeds what generous interpretation can continue absorbing. Here's the first thing worth understanding about this moment. It typically produces relief before it produces grief. This might sound counterintuitive, but understanding this sequence matters considerably for anyone currently experiencing it. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the exhausting cognitive labor required to maintain generous interpretation in the face of accumulating, contradictory evidence. The moment this labor finally stops, the moment you allow yourself to simply, fully see what's been genuinely happening, rather than continuing to construct alternative explanations, often produces an immediate, almost physical sense of relief, a release of tension you may not have fully recognized you were carrying. Here's the second thing worth understanding. This clarity, once genuinely achieved, tends to arrive with remarkable, almost startling completeness. Remember everything we've traced throughout our conversation about the sentence that reveals genuine self-trust. Unlike the gradual, uncertain process of building suspicion, once genuine clarity finally arrives, it typically doesn't feel tentative or partial. It feels complete, undeniable, retroactively illuminating countless previous moments that finally make sense within this new, accurate framework. Conversations that felt confusing at the time suddenly reveal their actual function. Behaviors that seemed inexplicable suddenly fit perfectly into a coherent, understandable pattern. Here's the third thing worth understanding. This moment often arrives specifically triggered by something relatively small, disproportionate to the magnitude of the shift it produces. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how accumulated evidence eventually exceeds a threshold, regardless of how minor the final triggering incident might seem in isolation. This is worth understanding directly because many people experience genuine confusion or even embarrassment about what specifically triggered their own moment of clarity, wondering why something relatively minor produced such comprehensive realization when considerably more significant incidents previously failed to produce the same effect. This disproportion isn't evidence of poor judgment. It's simply evidence of how threshold effects actually work. The specific final piece of evidence matters less than the accumulated weight it happens to complete. Let's trace what actually happens in the days and weeks following this specific moment of finally, completely seeing clearly, because the aftermath often unfolds through predictable stages worth understanding in advance, particularly since this period can feel genuinely disorienting even while producing genuine relief. Here's the first stage worth understanding: a specific kind of retroactive reprocessing where memory itself seems to shift in real time. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how accurate perception, once genuinely developed, allows previously confusing memories to finally make coherent sense. During this stage, expect memories from throughout the relationship to resurface with startling frequency, each one now viewed through this new, accurate lens rather than through the generous interpretation you'd previously applied. This reprocessing can feel genuinely overwhelming, precisely because it often involves reconsidering years of accumulated experience simultaneously rather than processing individual incidents one at a time the way you might have during the relationship itself. Here's the second stage worth understanding: grief that arrives specifically once the initial relief has had time to settle. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about giving genuine space to difficult emotions rather than bypassing them. Once the initial clarity and initial relief have had time to fully register, grief typically follows. Grief for the relationship you believed you were in. Grief for the version of this person you'd hoped was genuinely real. Grief for the time and energy invested in a connection that never actually functioned the way you believed it did. This grief deserves genuine space, exactly as we've traced throughout multiple previous conversations, rather than being rushed past in favor of the clarity's more immediately satisfying relief. Here's the third stage worth understanding: a specific kind of anger that often arrives with surprising intensity, sometimes considerably more intense than anything experienced during the relationship itself. This connects to something worth naming directly. While inside the relationship, generous interpretation often muted or redirected anger, transforming it into self-doubt or self-blame instead. Once clarity fully arrives and this generous interpretation finally stops operating, anger that was previously suppressed or misdirected often surfaces with full, unmuted intensity, sometimes catching people genuinely off guard with how strong it feels compared to whatever they experienced during the relationship's actual duration. Here's the fourth stage worth understanding, one that addresses something important about self-directed anger specifically. Many people experience genuine frustration or even anger toward themselves, wondering why they didn't see this clearly sooner. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about why these patterns are specifically designed to remain difficult to see from inside them. This self-directed anger deserves gentle, honest correction rather than validation. You didn't fail to see clearly because of some personal deficiency. You experienced exactly the specific, well-documented psychological mechanisms this entire series has traced across dozens of previous conversations. Mechanisms specifically engineered to make this kind of clarity genuinely difficult to achieve while you remain inside the relationship, regardless of your own intelligence, your own perceptiveness, or your own genuine capability. Here's the fifth stage worth understanding: a specific kind of embarrassment or shame about who you were around this person worth addressing directly. Some people, upon achieving this clarity, feel genuine discomfort, revisiting who they became during the relationship. Perhaps more anxious, more accommodating, more willing to excuse behavior they'd never accept from anyone else. This discomfort deserves the same self-compassion this entire series has traced extensively throughout previous conversations. You weren't naturally, permanently that version of yourself. You were responding, in genuinely reasonable ways given the circumstances, to a systematically distorted reality specifically engineered to produce exactly this response. Here's something crucial worth understanding about why these stages don't necessarily unfold in strict, sequential order. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about genuine psychological processing tending to loop and repeat rather than proceeding cleanly from one stage to the next. You might experience relief, then grief, then find yourself briefly returning to relief again, then experiencing anger, then finding self-directed shame resurfacing unexpectedly weeks later. This non-linear pattern represents genuine, ordinary human processing rather than evidence that something has gone wrong with your own healing trajectory. Because here's what all of this ultimately needs to lead toward, and it's worth being direct about it rather than leaving this conversation as simply a description of the stages that follow clarity without addressing what genuinely matters most. What actually happens once this entire processing period has run its course, and what genuine, lasting integration of this clarity ultimately looks like. The first thing worth understanding clearly is that finally seeing someone clearly represents genuine beginning rather than genuine ending, despite how complete and how conclusive the moment of realization itself often feels. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the extensive, patient work genuine healing actually requires. The grief fully processed, the self-trust rebuilt, the boundaries genuinely established. The moment of clarity we've traced throughout today's conversation represents the necessary starting point for this work, not its completion. Many people mistakenly believe that once they've finally seen clearly, the hardest part is behind them, when genuine, comprehensive healing typically still requires considerable time and considerable effort beyond this initial, crucial recognition. Here's the second thing worth understanding, one that addresses something important about how this clarity ultimately serves your continued life, extending far beyond this one specific relationship. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about pattern recognition becoming permanent, transferable protection. Once you've genuinely, completely seen this specific person clearly, you carry this same discernment forward into every future relationship, recognizing similar patterns considerably faster, requiring considerably less accumulated evidence before trusting your own accurate perception the next time something genuinely concerning begins to unfold. Here's the third thing worth understanding, one that circles back to something we've emphasized throughout this entire series in countless different forms. This clarity, once genuinely achieved, doesn't require his acknowledgement, his agreement, or his eventual understanding in order to remain permanently, completely valid. Remember everything we've traced throughout our conversation about the sentence that reveals genuine self-trust. Whatever narrative he continues constructing, whatever version of events he presents to mutual connections or to himself, none of this changes what you now finally, completely know to be accurately, genuinely true. Here's the fourth thing worth understanding, one that addresses something important about holding this clarity without allowing it to harden into permanent bitterness or permanent indiscriminate suspicion applied to everyone you encounter afterward. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the difference between healthy discernment and unhealthy, over-applied guardedness. Genuine clarity about this specific person and genuine understanding of the specific patterns this entire series has traced across dozens of previous conversations doesn't require you to treat every future relationship with the same suspicion, doesn't require permanent closure to genuine connection and genuine trust with people who've done nothing to warrant this specific level of caution. Here's the fifth and final thing worth understanding, the piece that ultimately matters most as we close this entire conversation. The moment you finally see someone for who they really are represents one of the most significant, most genuinely transformative moments available throughout your entire healing journey. Not because it resolves everything instantly, but because it removes the specific fog of confusion and self-doubt that previously prevented you from moving forward with genuine clarity. Everything that follows this moment, the grief, the anger, the eventual integration into permanent protective wisdom, represents genuine, valuable work, deserving of patience and deserving of the same self-compassion this entire series has traced extensively throughout dozens of previous conversations. You didn't fail by taking however long you took to reach this specific moment. You arrived exactly when your own psychology, working against exactly the mechanisms this entire series has traced extensively, finally accumulated sufficient evidence and sufficient internal permission to see clearly what had genuinely actually been happening throughout the relationship's entire duration. That clarity, once achieved, belongs entirely to you now, permanent and complete, requiring nothing further from him, from anyone else, or from any external confirmation in order to remain exactly, genuinely, permanently true. You finally see him now. And in seeing him this clearly, completely, you've simultaneously begun the process of finally, fully seeing yourself again too. Not through his distorted lens, not through the confusion he specifically worked to maintain, but through your own accurate, hard-won, permanently reclaimed perception, exactly as it was always, genuinely meant to be. There's one more dimension worth adding here, because it addresses something practical worth carrying forward. What do you actually do in the specific disorienting weeks immediately following this moment of clarity, when the relief and the grief and the anger we've traced throughout this conversation are all genuinely, simultaneously active, and daily functioning feels genuinely harder than it did even during the confused, self-doubting period that preceded this realization? Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about giving genuine, deliberate space to intense emotional processing rather than expecting yourself to simply resume normal functioning immediately. If you're currently in exactly this disorienting period, understand that this intensity, however overwhelming, typically represents a temporary, if genuinely difficult phase, rather than a permanent state. The specific overwhelm of finally seeing clearly precisely because it requires reprocessing so much accumulated experience simultaneously often produces genuine, significant disruption to ordinary daily functioning for a period of weeks, sometimes longer, before it gradually settles into something more manageable. Here's something worth understanding about a specific, practical support worth considering during exactly this period. Professional therapeutic support, particularly with someone experienced in narcissistic abuse recovery specifically, often proves genuinely valuable precisely during this immediate aftermath, when the reprocessing and the grief and the anger are all simultaneously active and genuinely difficult to navigate entirely alone. This isn't a sign of weakness or evidence that you're handling this poorly. It represents genuine, sensible support during a period this entire series has traced as requiring considerable psychological labor, work that often benefits substantially from professional guidance specifically calibrated to exactly this kind of realization and exactly this kind of aftermath. Here's something worth understanding about a related, specific concern many people experience during this period: the fear that clarity might somehow fade or weaken over time, that you might eventually slip back into the confusion and generous interpretation that characterize so much of the relationship's actual duration. This fear deserves direct, honest address. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how genuine clarity, once fully achieved, tends to remain remarkably stable, precisely because it's built on accumulated, thorough evidence rather than a single, isolated impression. This doesn't mean you'll never experience moments of doubt or moments of missing what you believed the relationship once was. It means the core, accurate understanding of who he actually is tends to remain intact even through these more transient, complicated feelings, providing a stable foundation even when the emotional experience surrounding it continues fluctuating. Here's a final consideration worth carrying forward from everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation, one that addresses something important about how to hold this clarity if you ever encounter him again, whether through circumstance, through mutual connections, or through any of the various ways relationships sometimes intersect even after significant separation. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about genuine detachment eventually developing into settled, permanent calm. The clarity you've achieved doesn't require ongoing defense or ongoing reinforcement each time you might encounter reminders of him. It simply exists now, quietly and permanently, available to inform your response whenever it might genuinely be needed, without requiring active, constant maintenance in order to remain accurate and complete. This is ultimately the most important thing to carry forward from everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation. The moment you finally see someone for who they really are doesn't simply end confusion about one specific relationship. It restores something considerably more foundational: your own trust in your own capacity to eventually, accurately perceive reality, even when that reality has been deliberately, systematically obscured for extended periods of time. This restored trust becomes permanent, transferable protection, available to you not just in relation to this specific person, but throughout every future circumstance where accurate perception genuinely matters, throughout every future relationship where trusting your own instincts considerably sooner and considerably more completely than you may have trusted them this time will protect you from ever again needing years of accumulated evidence before finally, completely allowing yourself to see clearly what's actually, genuinely happening in front of you. You see him now, completely, permanently, accurately, and in that seeing, you've reclaimed something considerably more valuable than simply understanding one specific person's true character. You've reclaimed your own fundamental capacity to trust what you perceive, to trust what you know, to trust your own accumulated evidence over anyone else's confident insistence that reality is something other than what you've genuinely, accurately witnessed. That capacity, once genuinely restored, remains permanently yours, protecting you throughout every chapter of your life that still remains ahead, considerably more equipped now than you've ever been before to see clearly, trust yourself completely, and never again require years of confusion before finally, fully recognizing exactly what you're looking at.